Right, well thank you so much for both coming and for staying. It's been a very crammed day, and I think that we're probably all suffering from a bit of brain fill at this point. So I'd just like to cram a bit more in there before we finish. I'm joined, I'm very pleased to say, by people in some very different places along the kind of startup journey. Richard Moros is a vastly experienced face in the startup scene. He founded Moo.com back when Silicon Roundabout wasn't even Silicon Roundabout, and has probably done more to change the face and certainly the hands of networking with Moo's mini cards originally, and now a range of products than anyone else in London. Sophie Barrett is the operations officer of Lanyard. Lanyard is a pretty fresh, pretty young startup. It was founded by two people on a honeymoon who found that their honeymoon was derailed by creating a viable business company. And it's the way that professional organizations and businesses arrange their meetings and record their meetings. Alexander Aseli is best known for his association with Aleph and Jawbone specifically, and now the Jawbone Up. But also has recently set up a London-based startup, State, an opinion network, which I'd love to hear more about. And Duncan Goff is also at the beginning of a startup journey, but unusually, and feel free to boo and throw food, he's chosen to do it in Berlin rather than London. And thank you. And that might be a good place to start, actually. You've obviously, Duncan, worked in London. You've worked for startups in San Francisco, and you find yourself in Berlin. It's cold. It is poor but sexy, I think the Berlin Tourist Board would tell us. Why Berlin? Deal with microphones.
It's a good question. It was partly through choice, partly through circumstance. I've been in London for 10 years. I've worked a little bit in San Francisco too, so I've had a bit of experience of both. Having been in London for quite a while, I wanted to change, and having the opportunity to start my own company, there's a freedom that comes with that. So with that freedom, Berlin came up as an option to go to. And I don't really want to answer the question by saying it's cheap, but it's cheap. And when you don't have much money, it goes a lot longer. So you can hire 7 people and go for a lot longer with 7 people than you can if you were in London. Like I say, I don't want to say that it is cheap, but that is a huge factor in there.
It does raise an interesting question, which is that London is not the cheapest city in the world to live in, let's say, and it's certainly not the cheapest city in the world to work in. We talk about Startup London, but of course we also talk about Startup Britain. And Richard, of course, you're a sponsor of Startup Britain. Oh good, you are. And so, from your perspective, and actually I'd like to throw this open to everyone, why London? I mean, why not, for example, Cambridge or Manchester?
Why London for us?
For you, but also, why would you recommend it to a startup, assuming you would?
London's a great city. I mean, you want to live in the city as well as work in the city. I mean, London was important to us because I was here, and I guess the first few people that I hired were here. But we're in London, actually. Perhaps more interestingly, our US office is in a non-obvious place. We're in Providence, Rhode Island, in the smallest state in the US. But it makes a lot of sense for us to be in London. Design is a big part of our business. Tapping into the design community in London is a fairly important part of our sort of story. We have everything that we want here. It's a fantastic city to build a business in, but it is a very expensive city without a doubt.
You mentioned design culture. One of the really interesting things about London, perhaps, is that the startup scene, certainly when we think about the startup scene, we still think about it very much in terms of Silicon Roundabout, in terms of Tech City, in terms of the Near East, which is also where historically the fashion business has been, the design businesses have been. And there is that sense that Matt Webb certainly talked about earlier, and Russell Davis, that we like to make things. We like to get ourselves, into objects. And Alexander, in San Francisco, rather bucking the trend, you had a very product-based startup. Aleph makes beautiful objects, beautiful earpieces, beautiful wristbands, things which are aesthetically pleasing as well as functional. Now you're doing a web-based startup. Is that massively simpler, or just a different challenge?
Creating good products, I think, on the whole, is just challenging. I think that the switch from hardware to software is just switching one set of problems for another, right? Hardware is intrinsically complicated and pricey because of the risks of having the wrong design, building a whole bunch of the wrong stuff and shipping it, which some of you guys maybe have seen we did last year with some, with quite a big splash with the first launch of the Up. And I think with software, the complexity comes more from having almost limitless scope. But ultimately, the goal is the same, which is to create a product or a service that is exciting and delightful and useful for people. So in a sense, you're still training the same neurons.
Right, right. And Sophie, I haven't forgotten you. I was going to ask. You were the third hire at Lanyard, and the first two hires, well, you were the first hire effectively, the third employee. The first two were the husband and wife team who created it. That's an interesting situation to be in. What does that first hire need to bring to the party? What do you think, I mean, what does the first hire do for a startup? What do they need to do?
Well, for us, it was Nat and Simon had come from a very development-led background, and they realised, obviously, as soon as they had finished Y Combinator and they got some money in their pocket, that they needed someone who would help them grow the company, would set that really important company culture that they wanted to take forward, and also to look after the everyday business side of the company, someone who could find out about US tax and help them sort that out on a yearly basis. So that's, for them, that was the most important hire. They got the development, they got the design. They needed someone else who would come in and look after every other aspect of the business and to teach them how to hire people and who to hire.
I mean, that seems to perpetuate the idea that people who have these ideas tend to be a little bit floaty.
I wouldn't like to say they were floaty.
Richard, you...
And this is the, you know, we maybe touch on later why some other cities do this better, but this is where London struggles. If you've got someone who's got a great idea, and I think those are scarce, and I think we should follow the good ideas rather than monitor them. That's a great point made earlier by Ben. But we don't have a long history and tradition of people that fill in these slots, these very important slots that fit around people with good ideas, that can really execute. You know, people that have had success stories. I mean, one of the biggest problems in London for hiring is product managers, just because we don't have a long history of product management in this country. We hire Americans, that's how we do it. And it will take generations of people learning product management in a way that needs to be done in our world. We have two challenges. We have a digital business and physical business and the complexities of the osmosis between the two. But that's where London needs to catch up, and it's sort of a very, very difficult thing to artificially invest in and kind of get it to try and move more quickly. But she's absolutely right. This is a huge problem for people with ideas, is finding the talent to build around them, to build a sustainable, scalable operation, machine that can take an idea from a PowerPoint presentation to, and if it's physical manufacturing, but all kinds of other complexities as well, into a real business.
Yeah, I think it's a really very good point. I think that there are certain skills like coding, research, and even entrepreneurship itself, setting up a company and driving it forward and filling it with energy every single day, that I kind of think it comes as a result of education or as a result of your nature. There are some other roles like product management or like manufacturing engineering that you can't really escape having experience, partly because there's a way that things work and a way in which products are created, the way in which teams interact with other companies, the way in which teams interact with certain platforms that you can't really escape. And I think that's a very valid point, and maybe goes into the deeper reaches of policy, which is around immigration and about the need for the UK to overcome some of the weird issues around electoral politics and just kind of get real with the immigration thing. The US has an immigration challenge in the sense that there's always a debate, but on the whole, it lets in enough people into the valley to where more than 50% of the top companies in the Valley were founded by foreigners, where most of the middle management in the Valley is driven by people from the Indian subcontinent. If you took those people out, the whole Valley would collapse. So, you know, I think it's a really important point relative to like London being like a real hub. Thank you.
And Duncan, of course, you are a foreigner in your chosen startup culture. We've talked about the diversity of London, the amazing diversity of London. Tom from IDEO obviously earlier talked about his investments and the fact that it turns out an awful lot of those are from companies who don't have British-born CEOs or founders. Speaking to your point, that maybe we're catching up with San Francisco in that way. How are you finding Berlin? I mean, it's sort of in the same way that London in particular is often seen as a junction point between the East and the West. Berlin, I guess, is the very heart of Europe. Where does the talent accumulate? And how do we get it?
I think the way in which it's different is that Berlin itself feels like a startup. It's so young and it's so, not empty, but there's so much free space in there at the moment. You can go and build it. In the way that there isn't in London, it's hard to kind of find room in London. And it sounds a bit weak and kind of rose-tinted, but there's an emotional space there as well as a physical space that you can go and build things. So it is different in that respect, and I found that to be really, really good. It's easy to feel adopted there, and you know, it's been a really quick process to get over there and to be part of the community. And the talent there, yeah, I think it's different to what I've seen in London, in that there's talent coming in from other parts of Europe that doesn't come in to London itself. I think it's easier to get into Berlin from, you know, Sweden or Czechoslovakia and places like that. Right. So there's a lot more there, and I think, I don't know whether this is true, but I think that in Berlin, if you've moved to Berlin, you feel a bit more adventurous, a bit more, you've made a conscious decision to get there. Whereas I think sometimes it's a default to get to London, it's quite easy to go there, and you might kind of just end up in London. So I think people who are there for a reason. That's the biggest change I've noticed.
Right, and when we talk about having emotional space, I guess, and talking about the emotions and culture of cities, it's very hard not to talk about San Francisco when we're talking about startups, because it's done so much to define how people are supposed to feel about startup culture, I guess. Not just in, you know, the attitudes and the entrepreneurial spirit, but also in the way it constructs itself. Alexander, certainly you've talked a lot about the cultural differences between San Francisco and London, and obviously, as Russell Davis said earlier, attempting to mimic San Francisco is not probably what we ought to be doing, but I'd love to hear from all of you, in fact.
Yeah, it's important to be authentic, and I'm a bit of a broken record on this now. I actually just don't like the Silicon Roundabout thing, and I'll say it again, because it's a bit sycophantic, and I think that London has amazing strengths of its own, and I think that it's important to bear in mind that San Francisco has only really become a place for startups in Silicon Valley relatively recently. I mean, Jawbone was one of the first companies, visible companies, to be based there. Twitter came relatively recently. The Valley itself is what we're talking about, and the Valley is really south, it's the peninsula, and it's centered in places like San Jose and Palo Alto. And look, at the end of the day, the reason why there's been a migration, particularly among software companies, so at higher levels of abstraction in the software layer, is because software developers who are working on games or working on like brand and stuff, they just want to live in a cool place. And so as a result, San Francisco has gained some of the startups that might have otherwise been founded in the Valley. Now, and I mentioned this to you, I think, when we spoke before. One of the challenges that places like New York has, and some other cities have, is that when you think about scaling an organization beyond a few hundred people, you start having to think about like having like thousands of employees who also have families. And one of the things that the Valley kind of was great at, and it kind of was a blank slate when it first started, in the way that perhaps Berlin is now, is that there was just a lot of cheap housing. And the housing was like 2-car garage and like a basketball hoop. And you could like take your kids to school in 20 minutes. There's like basic stuff like that that's important. Places like New York are quite tricky for that, because your only option for normal life is Brooklyn, and Brooklyn's also kind of constrained and getting expensive. Whereas I think London as a metropolis is actually just intrinsically better suited to it.
There's always somewhere cheaper and nastier and dirtier you can move if you need to.
Always, guaranteed. And so I think that in the case of London, I think we have phenomenal infrastructure at that level. I think that I believe a lot in what the government's done, obviously on the Tech City front and on Silicon Roundabout, and in promoting that particular ecosystem. But I also think that entrepreneurs need to appreciate, and entrepreneurs will appreciate, because it's the nature of entrepreneurs to think outside the box, but that you can set up your business anywhere in London, that it never takes more than really an hour to get from one part of London to another, which, by the way, is less time than it takes to get from one end of the valley to the other. And that ultimately you have a whole set of resources at your fingertips that are identical to the ones you would have in the valley. It's not easy to set up a company in the valley. I'm sure any of you guys who've been there will say the same. It's just not easier. It is an illusion that setting up a company in the valley is somehow easier. Yes, there's more access to capital, but the perseverance that's required to set up a company and push it through and get more funding and hire the best people and all the rest of it is incredibly hard there as well. And it's, in some ways, it's much more competitive. Now, I think that I'm going to say everything I need to say in this particular one. I think relative to things like financing and cost of living, this comes up a lot. And if I had to compare my experience in London versus San Francisco, there are kind of three dimensions to it, right? One is like, how much are you paying your average employee? What's your average cost per head? Right? It's lower in London than San Francisco. Right? Step one. Second one is, what can those employees buy for the money you're paying them? And I would say that it's marginally more expensive in London, in the sense that I think you can just get away with, people just know where to spend less money. You don't have to go and eat at Le Caprice every day or something, right? And then the third piece is the basic infrastructure costs, like getting an office and paying lawyers and all the rest of it. And that's kind of I would say that's a wash. So I'm not entirely sure that it's a big deal, the whole cost of living thing. And I would say the following: if you want to get a business that's backed by venture capital in London, you've got to think at a scale which is comparable to the businesses that are getting funded in California. And what I mean by that is, it's got to be more than just the UK if you can possibly manage.
So you need to have a global proposition, or at least a proposition.
You need to try to have a global proposition, or at least a proposition that has an addressable market that in the first phases is large enough. Why? Because if you're going to make the bet as an investor, you need to know that it has a chance of hitting it big, right?
And Richard, I think you realized fairly early on that massively more of your product was sold to the US than the UK. Did you ever think about upping sticks?
Well, we started week one. First of all, I had no idea we were going to sell anything. It was quite alarming when we started selling something. And in the first week, we shipped to about 100 countries, and we regularly shipped about 200 different countries in any given month. And about 50% of that is North America today. We have the challenge, obviously, of having to originally ship packets in the post from London. My brother actually used to carry them in a big sack over to Mount Pleasant from Rosebery Avenue, where we were based, and just insert them directly into the post. And it actually worked extremely well. Because the Royal Mail has all these fantastic links. People talk about networks, it's like a 300-year-old network. They stick it on, British Airways in the morning, off it goes, and it actually travelled extremely well for us. But the increasing demands of the US market, the pricing competition in the US, and the fact that our costs were in pounds and that we long-distance shipping, roughly 2 or 3 years in, that's a long time, we got to a scale which we could see ourselves opening the US office, and we opted for a relatively inexpensive location. It's an operations office. There may be 40 people there today, mostly focused on customer services and manufacturing and fulfillment.
You never thought that your corporate future lay in the West?
You mean further west?
Yes.
No. Okay. No, because we're not a business that, we're a technology business, sure, but we're more a technology-enabled business. We employ as many marketers and designers and customer service people as we do developers. So that might be a strong pull, but I don't think that the values, the starting salary of a developer in the Valley is more than some CEOs that I know. So it's a very, very competitive market.
Sure, and I guess that I guess that brings us back to employees and the kind of mix of employee that you get in London in particular. Design-led, often creative, maybe product management, as you say, that kind of hard skill. is maybe not so present, and we don't have Stanford pumping people out immediately to be kind of sucked into Menlo Park. I'd like to go back to something that Rowan Silver announced this morning, which is very interesting. The apprenticeship, the Tech City apprenticeship plans. Sophie, obviously, you're a hirer of people, and your job when you were first hired by Lanyon was to build a team, to find amazing people to put it together as something more than a husband and wife startup. But all of you, I'm sure, all of you are hired people, obviously. Do you think that apprenticeship is the way forward? I mean, there's something very retro about the idea. But I mean, would you like to have sort of a government initiative embedding people in your business? I mean, do you think that's a beneficial thing for the companies, or primarily a beneficial thing for the young people?
Well, I'm currently actually looking for an intern, which I guess is somewhat similar in many ways. We need someone who's keen to increase their research skills and to help us out looking at new markets. So it's sort of a marketing and research role. And we had an intern for a couple of weeks in the summer to help us out with similar things. And I looked specifically at universities. I wanted someone who could come in their summer holidays and who get as much out of working for a startup as we get out of them. They're paid internships, but we wanted to make sure that we were building ties with universities and encouraging students to go out and work in industry. I like the fact that it's a short. Ours is 3 months at the most. It's short, embedded. Do that, off you go. Apprenticeships, not sure about really. It seems like an odd way of doing it.
How do you mean? Just a Victorian kind of vibe?
Yeah. I don't know, it sounds a bit industrial really, but I guess that's a good thing. But it sounds like it's a government way of trying to push through, get more people into this industry, but I think there are better ways of doing it myself. But.
Okay, any thoughts on the apprenticeships? I mean, I know that we have limited information about it so far.
We're participating in a scheme, so I can talk about it from our perspective.
Please.
So I think we're a manufacturing business, so learning a trade in a business like ours is perhaps more easy than going in something a little less sort of straight and vocational.
You are a printers as well as
we're
a technology company.
We have specific jobs that people can do there that they can learn and pick up very easily. And the primary difference, I think, between an internship and an apprenticeship is the apprenticeship is a long-term commitment. It's a minimum of 18 months. It's salaried in a formalised way, and I think it's much more sort of vocational, something that they could potentially stay in that career for many years rather than where they might flip between different roles. The challenge, though, for any startup taking on board that type of employee is we're all so bloody busy. The problem is training people. This is the first year. We are 6 and a half years in. We haven't had a training budget until now. We're going to spend it on something else. I know we're going to spend it on a Christmas party or something rather than training. But it's a real challenge for us finding the time. Everyone's multitasking for the first few years. There's no real specialists, so other than making developers. But it's a real challenge to integrate it into a small business.
Right. So training is an issue to the point where possibly a kind of an enforced training regime from government is not a terrible thing, in a nice way, obviously. So I think we should probably wrap up, but I just wanted to ask you all really briefly. Let's say you have a friend. I'm not saying you don't. You have a friend who's thinking of starting up. They have capitalization. They have a fantastic idea. They have a dream. We've seen this descend into horror many, many times, but let's assume that this is a good one. What would you say to them to make the case for London? I mean, Alexander, for example, obviously you have made the case for London by moving here yourself. Clearly, there's something which is attractive there. But what, if they were literally sort of cosmopolitan, thinking of setting up anywhere, whether it was San Francisco, New York, Beirut, Athens, why London, or why not London, I guess, in your case. But no, what's great about London if you're in that position?
You just have to have a walk around. It's one of the greatest cities in the world. And as we've heard already, the barriers to getting things done are actually relatively low. That there are lots of similarities to the US. Depends on the type of business that you're running, but the strengths here are design and other things that we talked about. So, more question of why not London than why London.
Right.
One thing's for sure, though. 50 years ago, there wasn't a conference in San Francisco talking about how they could, design this future environment. These things are going to be organic. They're going to take a long time, this is an amazing magnet for the city, and just not worrying about it.
And Brighton-based Sophie?
Yes, I think London has such an incredibly rich historical industrial history. I think San Francisco is very, very technology-based, New York sort of more financial. London has everything in its history. And I think that's a wonderfully rich tapestry that we can draw from. And we can use those skills and that experience in our startups and in our future startups. And I think that's a really good way to be here.
Yeah, I think it's pretty good points. One thing I would add is that I think that London clearly is a crossroads. It's like a global capital. It's the one place where people from around the world feel comfortable being. So I actually would highly encourage people who want to set up global businesses, whether they be British or non-British, to do it in London, because you can vibe off the different cultures that are here. What I would say though is that I kind of feel like London needs to make it cool to be a techie in a way that it hasn't really been to date. And you don't have that issue in Silicon Valley, right? So maybe the one resistance, or one little friction that you get here is you don't have this tailwind of, yeah, it's kind of cool to start a company and be techie and be geeky about stuff and get into the stack and, to fly to China to meet the manufacturer. Hasn't yet become cool, and I think it's really worth. I think the best thing, the way that the government can do. I think that the apprenticeship thing has got obviously good intentions, but guys like James Dyson and other entrepreneurs like him who've really persevered. I mean, that's an amazing story, right? I mean, who the hell thought you could take on like the Hoover companies, right? But he did it, and he set up a really hot standalone company that leverages actually talents that the British already have. And that's on not just that's creativity design, but it's also on the marketing side, which is very strong. And I think London is world class. It's not like, well, they're kind of as good as San Francisco, but not quite as good. Like world class marketing, advertising, design in London, and I think totally leverage that.
Right. So it's the related skills. And Duncan, I mean, your startup somewhere is about finding ideal working environments. Finding ideal working environments for people. What would it be that would win you back from London, I guess? What is it that you miss that made it a good working environment for you?
So I think that if you want the classic startup experience, you should go to San Francisco. I think if you really want to find out what you're made of, you can do it in London, because if you manage to do it in London, that's very, very impressive. I think if you want to build a company and build a city at the same time, you can do it in Berlin. I think that's the place where you have to do everything for yourself, and because you are starting from scratch with the city at the same time. What would bring me back? I desperately want to come back. I haven't run away. It's just they burned Croydon down, so.
Right. Yeah, that was a tragedy. On which note, I'd like to thank my panel, Richard, Sophie, Alexander, and Duncan.